Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Thank you for downloading this edition of The Why Factor from the BBC World Service, the programme about why we do the things we do. I'm Sandra Canthall, and in this week's edition, why do stories matter?
There's a man in bed, and he wakes up, and it's weird because the house is silent, and it isn't supposed to be silent.
I want you to listen to a story. Not a love story or a crime story. A dopamine story.
So he puts his feet down on the cold floor and he walks toward the door of the bedroom, and it's open, which is again very, very strange because the house is supposed to be empty. He walks out into the hallway, and as he walks along the hallway, he hears exactly what he doesn't want to hear. As he approaches the living room and looks into the living room, he also sees exactly what he doesn't want to see.
David J.P. Phillips knows how to get your attention.
When I'm saying he's hearing something that he doesn't want to hear, he's seeing something that he doesn't want to see, you want to know what that is. And that creates a small surge of dopamine.
And then you're hooked.
Dopamine is absolutely essential in all storytelling. Your entire purpose as a presenter is to create dopamine in your audience. If you do that, then they'll listen to your message.
Telling stories. It's how we connect to one another. Stories teach us empathy, allow us to feel what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, and evolve to show us what society considers acceptable and what will not be forgiven. You're listening to The Why Factor on the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthall, and this week, why do stories matter?
If you're a good communicator, you get a better career. You get better relationships with your spouse, your kids, your friends, your colleagues. You get the opportunity to pitch your ideas. People listen to you. You're one of those individuals that walk into a room and the room goes quiet because they want to hear what you have to say.
David J.P. Phillips is a communication expert, a professional storyteller. He doesn't describe stories by their genre, but by the different hormones they release in your brain. So he can tell oxytocin stories.
That can be created in stories by adding empathy, setbacks for the character. So the more you feel for the character, the more oxytocin you'll produce because of the setback.
And testosterone stories.
So if we listen to a story about someone who's taking loads of risks, which we can relate to, our testosterone levels go up.
David's TED Talk on the magical science of storytelling has been viewed more than 1 million times. He started getting interested in how people communicate when he was growing up in Sweden, and he was a pretty curious kid.
I dove into neurocognitive psychology as a 16-year-old, which is pretty odd. And what was even more odd was that I bought an electroencephalograph when I was 17 just to be able to study and analyze my own brain from a communicative perspective.
You bought your own electroencephalograph machine?
Yes.
How did you know how to work it?
I guess at that point of time I wasn't super skilled in reading the results, but I could still see that what I did had an impact on the brain in one way or another.
Despite having no formal scientific training, David set out on his own extensive research program. Over 7 years, he studied more than 5,000 public speakers and assembled a list of 110 essential communication skills. He's arranged them in a color-coded chart, which resembles the periodic table. Columns like voice skills are in yellow, body language in various shades of orange, facial expressions in green, among others. These are the tools he considers instrumental to the one thing we would all like to communicate about ourselves.
A core part of human personality is being significant. If you go into a coffee room or you go into a meeting or a presentation and you start talking about boring things, you won't become significant because people will stop listening to you. So we will start to tell stories about what can make us significant. Every single time you retell a event to a friend or a colleague, that is storytelling. That is way closer to us than the opposite, which is PowerPoints filled with bullets. Nobody thinks in bullets. Nobody thinks in slides. It is just not a humane way of communicating. Storytelling is.
We tell stories because we want people to know what it feels like to be like us, and we listen to stories because we want to know what it's like to be other people. In a good story, you identify with the protagonist, you learn as they do.
John York is a BBC TV drama producer and a narrative consultant, advising writers, advertising executives, and even historians on how to enhance their stories. He's also the author of Into the Woods, in which he argues that story structure is hardwired in all of us, helping us make sense of the world.
If we boil it down to something really simple, you are asking me information and I am replying, and in response to that information, you are changing. Not necessarily for the better or worse, but you're listening and you're making sense of what I'm saying. So effectively, that's a process of learning. And out of that, that's 3-act structure. That's beginning, middle and end. That's you go on a journey and discover something and take that back home. That's the universal shape. In film and theatre, that's expressed in acts. In books, that can be expressed in any number of ways, but chapters is the most typical.
Elements of this basic shape can be traced back centuries.
If you take thinking back to its absolute basics, we get into what they call dialectics. This goes all the way back to the Greeks, but it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And storytelling is that process fictionalized. So a character at the beginning of a typical story doesn't know something. They go on a journey, learn that during the journey, and then they apply that learning when they arrive at their destination. And so that's really where the story shape comes from.
And there's a reason we respond to this way of learning.
Studies have found that similar amount of facts presented in a story context is faster to read and it's better remembered than the same facts presented in a standard scientific logical way. My name is Mirta Galesic. I'm a professor and Cowan Chair for Human Social Dynamics at the Santa Fe Institute. It seems that information presented in stories is both more interesting for us and it's easier to understand and then to transmit again to another person. And so they seem to be the main mechanism of transmission of our culture that we just developed over millennia.
Often the reason why we feel so motivated to pass on stories is because the stories do tap in to certain universal human fantasies and fears that will often transcend the concerns of particular times and places.
Jamie Tarani is a professor at Durham University in the north of England. Torn between literary scholarship and anthropology, he decided to embark on research which encompassed both, exploring common themes in folk and fairy tales that have travelled in stories through different cultures around the world.
We found about 35 of these tales that could be traced back to cultures that existed thousands of years ago, and some stories that could be traced back even further, including one that we were able to reconstruct in the last common ancestor of all surviving Indo-European peoples. And the story is best known as the tale of the Smith and the Devil. In the tale of the Smith and the Devil, there's a highly skilled blacksmith, but he wants to be even better. So he makes a deal with the devil, or in some variants, it's the personification of death. And in the deal, the blacksmith asks for complete supernatural mastery over his craft. In return, he will give up his soul to the devil. And this is a tale that we find all across the Indo-European speaking world, from South Asia to Scandinavia. Today we find echoes of it in particularly the Faust legend. Again, somebody who sells their soul in return for the unrivaled mastery of all scholarship, which itself has evolved into stories like the famous blues guitarist Robert Johnson, who sold his soul to the devil in order to become the greatest blues guitarist on earth.
I went to the crossroads, fell down on my knees.
Interestingly, one of the things that's dropped out of the story in more recent times is the happy ending for the protagonist. So whereas the blacksmith ends up having this great victory over the devil, in all modern versions, that ending has been basically lost, which just goes to show how these stories are always evolving.
Tracking these stories through their varying forms reveals something elemental in our human psyche.
We are intensely moralistic. Most of the time, the bad guys have unhappy endings and the good guys have happy endings. We know that in the real world, it doesn't actually work like that. So there's an element of wish fulfillment that somehow satisfies our moral appetite.
Because I grew up on folk stories, they were a really big part of my life. My name is Elizabeth Barron, and I am the founder of Zenafri Limited.
Elizabeth is an entrepreneur in Abuja, Nigeria, who designs educational apps for children. And she's working to preserve the traditional stories she heard as a child.
I had a song stuck in my head, and then I remembered that, this came from a folk story I heard when I was very young. And I got thinking, are these folk stories still around? Has somebody thought of putting them online or something? So I did some research, and I couldn't really find one from my particular culture, from my tribe.
Which song was it that was in your head, and which tribe do you belong to?
I'm Tiv from Benue State in Nigeria. I can't... You want me to sing the song in my tribe?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay, it goes to no more. Alome ya kivyo mgelem yememo. Alome ya gamatue magba yandilo din.
That's lovely. What does it mean?
It was a folk story. The tortoise had stolen from a household. The king had killed a goat for a feast, and traditionally the head belongs to the king. So he had tricked the wife and eaten the head that belongs to the king. So the king came and was asking all his wives who had eaten the head of the goat, and all of them were denying. But the wife that had connived with the tortoise to eat the head, they had an oracle. They called the oracle. The oracle said, okay, that they're going to cross the stream, and the guilty parties are going to fall into the stream and drown. So they all sang the song, and all the innocent ones crossed, and the tortoise and the guilty wife were swept away.
So the moral of that story is?
Don't cheat, don't steal, don't lie.
Elizabeth wants to preserve these stories because she thinks modern life is driving them out of the cultural mainstream.
It was mostly an oral tradition. I heard folk stories from my grandmom and my aunts, but these days parents are busy, the extended family is not as close as it used to be. Mostly people just communicate via mobile phones or FaceTime or stuff. So children aren't exposed to folk stories anymore the way they were. So I'm trying to see if I can pick out a few to preserve.
Elizabeth's dream is to create an African Disney. No easy task. But if she did pull it off, it would be a great story. Because conquering adversity is a very recognizable storyline. And we know this because in 2016, academics at the University of Vermont in the United States and the University of Adelaide in Australia analysed the emotional arc of more than 1,700 stories, all fictional and in English, from Project Gutenberg. Their research found 6 core story arcs which form the building blocks of complex narratives. Rags to riches, riches to rags, man in a hole where the protagonist falls then rises, Icarus, the main character rises then falls, Cinderella, rise, fall, rise, and Oedipus, fall, rise, fall. The study was inspired by the author Kurt Vonnegut.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, it's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with 2 nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See?
Cinderella is our top female character name, year on year. She always is. Santa Claus is always our top male.
Samantha Armstrong is a senior publisher of children's dictionaries at Oxford University Press. Since 2012, they've been collecting the approximately 100,000 short stories that children ages 5 to 13 submit each year to a BBC Radio 2 competition.
500 Words is back. Wherever your story starts, now's the time to get writing.
Do you think children are more enthusiastic storytellers because they have a freer sense of imagination than we do as adults?
100%, because I've tried to write a 500-word story and it's very difficult. But when you look at the stories that the children write, they go happily into creating wild mixtures. The most fun is when they pull together characters and plot lines from a variety of different influences. We've got one here. Katniss was trying to shoot Peppa Pig. The Gruffalo was terrorising all the rainbow magic fairies. Tracy Beaker was running around with Harry Potter's wand. The next morning, his business partner, Donald Trump, came in and he fired Luke Skywalker for horrible work.
Being able to aggregate and analyse the work of these young authors gives grown-ups an insight into the events children absorb from the world around them.
Every year we pull out a word of the year, and what we can see with those words of the year is what they're influenced by. So in 2018, last year, the word of the year was plastic, and then they have some fun making a dynamic story out of it. So, for example, we had Plastic Fairy was one, Evil Mr. Plastic, and the best was Professor I Got It and the Fantastic Sewage Super Pooper Sucker Upper.
But adults can also be motivated by simple stories.
We're gonna build it up stronger than we've ever been. Once we get started,
a trait which can be exploited.
We're gonna make America great, make America great again. We're gonna
Make America Great Again is a brilliant story in that many words.
The narrative consultant John York again.
Donald Trump is the master of Hollywood story structure. Drain the Swamp is a story in 3 words. Hillary Clinton's campaign slogan, Stronger Together, isn't a story. And that's the difference between them.
How do you get a whole story out of the 4 words, Make America Great Again? That's a slogan, it's not a story.
Well, it's a slogan, but it infers narrative structure because it infers a protagonist, which is you. It infers an antagonist, which is all the people that have dragged America into the cesspit with its, hideous attempts to bring socialism to this, Republican-dominated country. And it's got an action, which is driving forward. With me, we will go forward and be great. So all the key elements of narrative are inferred from this boiled-down thing. I mean, it's kind of brilliant. In a way, it's horrendous, but brilliant. And that's what politicians do.
America great, make America great.
And that's the terrible thing about stories. Stories are tyrannical as much as they're useful. They're open to a hideous abuse because stories tend towards binary simplicity. They're at their most effective when they're binary and simple. But of course, real life isn't.
This is especially true when the subject is science. Scientists work in facts, often dry, dense, and not easy to digest. Finding better ways to convey complex information is a challenge Mirta Galesic of the Santa Fe Institute is working on at the moment.
Scientists are taught that the best communication is the one that's completely devoid of emotion, of context, of any kind of personal involvement, because that enables the ideal of scientific thought, which is analytic thought and deduction from general to specific. However, most of the population is not used to science speak. So we as scientists, we need to really learn to tell better stories. Now, the trick is, of course, to solve this ethical dilemma of telling a story but to not deceive. And that, I think, is something for serious future research. How to incorporate all the important facts in the story, make it interesting but make it correct, make it transparent so that people still have the power to make their own mind.
Perhaps a class on how to write a good story would help.
If you ask someone, well, tell me, what is a plot? They find it impossible to define what that is. What differentiates a story from a series of events that does not add up to a story?
The novelist Sandra Newman runs workshops on creative writing. Her most recent book is called The Heavens.
Essentially what a plot is, it's a setup with a payoff.
Sandra Newman, with her partner Howard Mittelmark, are the authors of How Not to Write a Novel, a handbook of over 200 common mistakes authors should avoid at all costs. First among them,
absolute number one rule, we need to be able to understand your story. There are some people who actually are so unfortunately bad at communicating that even when they tell a story to another person, it becomes incomprehensible. And gradually, as they stop making sense and ramble and digress and don't know where they're going, you see everybody not only lose interest, but become hostile. People become very frustrated when someone is not getting to the point.
Because, of course, the act of listening to a story involves giving someone your time and your attention, and if they waste it, you would resent that, wouldn't you?
It feels almost like a betrayal of trust. It's really an interesting thing. When we listen to somebody, we're giving ourselves over into their power to a certain degree. We're allowing ourselves to be just a little bit hypnotized by them and trying to see the world from their point of view. And if they don't give us anything in return, we feel as if we've been just a tiny bit robbed.
Stories help us make sense of the world, which is why we've been telling them to each other for millennia, and why some of the earliest tales still exist in some form to this day.
They are the products of generations and generations of great storytelling, and why they are still really the inspiration for so much contemporary fiction. The sort of moral tenor, the moral messages of the stories changes over time, and we see that when we look at some of the classic fairy tales. Tales like Cinderella have changed depending on who is telling the story and the particular period in which it's told.
They have changed because we have changed. In next week's Y Factor, we'll continue this story by tracing the path of Cinderella over time and across cultures and continents to ask what her transformation tells us about ourselves. You've been listening to the Y Factor on the BBC World Service. I'm Sandra Canthal. The programme was mixed by Rod Farker and our editor is Richard Knight.